Welcome everybody to today's AI ethics seminar. Today's speaker is Bram Vaassen from Umeå University, who will speak about explanation and the autonomy of affected parties. We'll have a Q&A towards the end, but you should feel completely free to ask questions in the chat during the talk, and we can then bring them up orally during the Q&A. But Bram, most welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, thanks Ola for having me, and thanks everybody for showing up. Right, so the title of the talk is, as announced, explanation on the autonomy of affected parties. This is broadly a talk focusing on the XAI or transparency in AI decision-making questions. And the idea is that a lot has been said both about how it might affect the people who we're making decisions about and the people using these operating systems or machines or whatever term you want to use for the AI systems. But I think when we're talking about the autonomy of the people involved, a lot of the literature and the legislation has actually focused on the autonomy of the people using the systems rather than the autonomy of the affected parties. And I think there's good reason to also focus on the autonomy of the affected parties. So that's the broad gist of it. I had really hoped that when I press this, it would, there we go, good. Here's the setup, right? The opacity of AI decision algorithms is morally problematic. That's something that a lot of parties agree on, but there's a lot of reasons why it would be morally problematic or could be morally problematic. I'm going to give at least one reason for thinking that there's a moral challenge involved with opaque decision making. To be clear from the get-go, I think this is a problem with opaque decision making across the board. So I don't think this is a very specific AI ethics problem. It is specifically AI ethics in the sense that there is this belief or going around that decisions made by AI systems are typically opaque. And if that's the case, then it becomes a specific AI problem in the sense that whenever we use them, we'll have to work harder to get it transparent decision-making, right? What I mean by transparent decision-making is simply that we have some explanation available for the outcome of the AI system. So suppose we use an AI system to detect whether or not a person has Alzheimer's. Does this system just give me a yes or no, or does this system give me a yes because? And the because then would hopefully track what the system went by to make the decision that this person would have Alzheimer's or not. Good. Here's the setup. I'm going to talk about AI and transparency very, very briefly. It's going to be the preschooler introduction to the problem of transparency in AI. Then I will talk about what other people have said about the issues, the moral issues with opacity, moral and practical issues, broadly speaking. What is the problem with getting these kinds of decisions from AIs without really knowing how they reach that conclusion? Then I'm going to give you my own view on what might be a problem without contradicting any of the other issues. It's going to basically build on philosophy of causation. So the idea is that we need explanations because explanations give us manipulation strategies, and manipulation strategies are very important to lead your life. It's the blurb. And then I'll look at some practical consequences real quick. Good. All right, so AI and transparency. Again, this is the preschooler introduction, right? This is how one gets introduced to these topics. There's all the new AI, the old AI you wired by hand, so to speak, If you wanted an AI that was going to detect what animals are mammals and which animals are not mammals, you'd basically write in line for line, well, if it's a pig, it's a mammal. If it's a duck, it's not a mammal. If it's a platypus, it's really neither, and so on and so on. You wrote this in by hand yourself, and then afterwards, you could use this algorithm to apply the rules that you introduced to it. In a way that on its face seems more transparent, because all the rules it goes by are like nicely written in hand in a way that a programmer, at least in some point in his life, understood. The new AI, again, speaking very coarsely, does not work like that. It just feeds a batch of animals, either by pictures or by names or whatever the detection algorithm is supposed to be trained on. And then it says, well, give me some results. You say, no, these aren't good, try again. Well, these are a bit better, try again. You do this again and again, and the algorithm trains itself to do this, such that in the end, there's this incredibly complex, not written by humans, so to speak, written by the algorithm itself, that will get you the output. And the way people say, the way people summarize this is to just say, well, there's this big black box where the procedure is supposed to be transparent, right? So rather than knowing rule by rule what is going on, there's this big black box that we can't really look inside of or get any information out of. All we know is, in the end, does it get all of these cases right? Does it tell me that a pig is a mammal and a duck is not a mammal, or does it not? So that's what I mean when I say that certain AI systems might not be transparent, is there's a black box rather than a transparent procedure. And that can be combined, or that idea can be used as a background when we start looking at the many uses of AI. So college applications in the US by now use some AI systems, or so they claim, to just make a first selection on who could get into college or not. It's used in the medical profession. It's used in bail hearings, and so on and so on. Loan applications, job applications, social benefits. All of these procedures are more and more relying on, at least in some aspect, using an artificial algorithm to decide whether or not you will get your loan, whether you will get bail, whether you will get to go to college, or whether or not you have Alzheimer's. Good. So these two facts combined have made people call for transparency in the XAI literature, as it's been called. And this has happened in policy texts. This has happened in the academic literature. This has happened in popular works. And more recently, this has also happened in some of the law texts. So both in the EU and in the US, some of these texts do talk about the importance of explanation for both the affected parties and the people using these algorithms. But however intuitive that might seem, if we're really going to go as far as implementing it in law or making it policy, it might be worth knowing why exactly we want transparency, right? And I think there's a lot written on this, and I'm going to rehearse very briefly some of the issues with opacity, which I take to be the opposite of transparency, right? What would really be the problem if we use these sort of black box systems to make decisions? That is, systems that might very well be reliable, but we don't really know how they produce their outcomes. So people have pointed out that it's very hard to trust these systems. And it might just be overall bad if we trust the systems that are in control of, or bail hearings, or loan applications, or job applications, or college applications. It's very important that we trust these systems in a sense of social cohesion, or, well, not having the masses on the street, so to speak. So I think that's a very good reason, and there's plenty of data to suggest that we do trust decisions more when we have explanations for their outcomes. Having said that, there's also some data suggesting that we trust decisions too much when we get explanations for their outcomes. So apparently there's research, for example, and this is not an AI case, but if somebody cuts in line and you ask, hey, what are you doing? And they answer, oh, I'm in a hurry. People will typically already take that as sort of a more trustworthy reply than not saying anything at all. But of course, I'm in a hurry is a very bad explanation. It's not a very helpful explanation either. So just the suggestion of an explanation might actually also already make us trust things too much. So the whole issue about trust and transparency is a whole other field, or is a whole other can of worms, so to speak, that I'm not going to go into here. I'm happy to take questions in Q&A. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about this. But the idea is that all else equal, transparent systems are more trusted and supposed to be more trustworthy, because at least we know what's going on there. I think there's this very intuitive feeling that I want to know what went in there. Having said that, it's not entirely clear that trust requires transparency. So trust could be engendered in all kinds of different ways. Like, it might be that we just independently know this is the most reliable system in the world, and that's why we trust it to do whatever it's designed for. But again, all else equal, transparent systems are trusted more. Then there's the worry that if we don't know what's going on there, how do we really know that it is reliable? And how do we really know that there is no bias involved? So if I don't know what went into my loan applications, how do I not know that my race or gender or political orientation did not play a role in the decision on that loan application? And this is the bias part of it is a specifically affected party, so to speak, oriented worry, right? This is about the people applying for loans and getting decisions. And given that loans and college applications and job applications are so important in our everyday life, it's important that these decisions are made in a very fair way and in an unbiased way. The idea is as well that if we don't really know, if we can't really tell whether there is a bias, we can't fix it either. I'm assuming here that biased algorithms are unreliable, right? They would make race, for example, play a larger role than it should, assuming that it shouldn't play a role at all in most cases. And even if it should play a small role, it might, come to play a way bigger role than it's allowed to be. The next point, I'll finish this off with a final sort of perhaps more skeptical question about this motivation is, it's unclear that, or at least in principle, there could be a perfectly reliable, unbiased algorithm that is not transparent at all. So it would be an epistemic issue whether we can, it would be an epistemic problem rather than a conceptual problem for transparency approaches. So I think it tells us something about the instrumental value of transparency towards bias or reliability. It does not tell us that much about the intrinsic value of transparency per se. Other people have pointed out that it's very hard to negotiate or renegotiate an outcome if you don't know what went into that outcome, what went into the process leading up to that outcome, right? So we want to have a certain right of redress for a certain outcome. So if my college application gets rejected, I want to be able to know why it got rejected, such that I can say, hey, wait a minute, that's for example, wrong information. It says here that my GPA is 2.5, but it's actually 3.9 or something like that, right? You want to be able to renegotiate or at least hold those who take decisions accountable for the kind of decisions they make. But if the entire process is a black box, then it's very hard to so to speak, point the finger at the part where you want to start your negotiations. Again, I think this is a very important issue. I think there's a lot to be said about it. But I think also, again, that like it's not inconceivable to me that we have negotiability without transparency. Like we could rely on external mechanisms to say, well, if you want to fight this application, then we're going to look piece by piece for what is missing there, rather than going inside the algorithm. We'll just use another human-driven algorithm or a more transparent algorithm to look at this. This would, of course, mean you'll give up some speed whenever people try to use their right of redress, but I think that is normal. That is what always happens. Finally, there's some people who think it's just unfair. And what is just unfair? What is unfair is that we demand so much transparency from these AI algorithms. And they point out, well, really, how transparent are the reasons of humans? So judges will often write verdicts, but of course, we don't really know whether they tell the truth when they write those verdicts, right? They can come to a verdict based on the race of the person they're writing a verdict about, rather than actual reasons, and they might just keep that hidden from us. So it's unclear that humans are any more transparent than AIs, is what people have said. I do think there is a genuine question about the fairness of the standards we would hold AIs to. But I also think it's a very weird move to say, well, humans do this poorly, therefore we should allow AIs to do it poorly as well. It seems that in either way, the argument isn't very strong. I think if we find out that a judge went by race rather than by the actual facts of the matter relevant to a judgment, we would hold it against the judge and there would be problems, right? And I think we should do the same with the AI. And I think whatever mechanisms we try to make our judicial system as it stands run by humans as transparent as possible should be at least upheld for AIs as well. And again, I don't think anything about the opacity in decision-making is AI specific. I think that if there are problems with opaque decision-making, then these are problems whether or not one implements the opaque decision-making via an AI or via a human or via, a hamster running in a wheel making decisions. Good. Finally, some people have just said, like, we just love explanations, right? The reason why this should be transparent is that we have, so to speak, a right to explanation. And I feel like that line is genuinely onto something. I think that's a very important insight, but I think it sort of stops short because you might wonder, what's so special about explanation? And I think to some extent it would be fine if it's just like, it turns out we love them, right? It's something we like, having explanations, and therefore those preferences should be respected for whatever reason. I think there's that would be a fine line to end on, but I think there's more to be said. I think there's like good research on why we love explanations. And I think that research actually helps us move forward with AI debates as well. Okay, that's what I claim. Why do I claim that? Let me get to it. I think in general, explanation gives us the kind of causes and reasons that would in principle allow us to manipulate the outcome of the algorithm. Or in principle, possibility to manipulate outcomes allows us to have knowledge of effective strategies. For example, if I know that the algorithm I'm looking at goes by the color of the sweater I wear, so to speak, then at least I know that it's important what kind of sweater I wear. And you can make all kinds of worries about whether it's fair that it goes by the sweater I wear. But setting all of those aside, it would be good for me as an applicant in a job interview to know that the sweater I wear is very important, because then I can try to get the best sweater possible, so to speak. That's sort of the very preschooler idea of what I'm going for. Let me flesh that out a bit more. Okay, so what I want to say is that opacity just means that the opacity of an AI system to a certain person just means that the person does, I'm sorry, let me just read it out as it stands, because otherwise we're not getting anywhere. Opacity is defined as an AI system is procedurally opaque to A to the extent that A does not grasp the causal explanations of its outcomes, right? So what it means for the college application system to be opaque to me, well, its opacity is just the extent to which I don't really know what caused that algorithm to make the decision it made, right? Is it because my extracurriculars aren't good enough, or is it because my grades aren't good enough? Is it because my cover letter was boring? I have no idea, right? Transparency is just the opposite, right? An AI system is procedurally transparent to the extent that A does grasp the causal explanations for its outcomes, right? And I want to stress that grasping and causal explanation, these are very, very, very contested concepts in the philosophy of causation and the philosophy of explanation and the philosophy of mind. But I do think that like most of the standard mainstream ideas of causation and explanation and grasping will get us what we want. And I think they're intuitive enough, right? What it means to grasp a causal explanation is just to understand that A caused B, and if A had been different, then B would have been different. And the gradual nature of opacity and transparency is taken to be a feature, not a bug. I think it's actually quite, it's extremely plausible that opacity and transparency are a matter of degree. So I might know, for example, that the system, I might, for example, know that the system goes by the color of my sweater, but I don't really know which kind of colors it likes and which kind of colors it dislikes. Then the system is somewhat transparent to me. We can, I don't know how we would quantify that, but I think it's intuitive enough. It would be more transparent to me if I knew exactly what kind of colors give a yes and exactly what kind of colors give a no. And I think there's a real debate that starts right after this talk, so to speak, about what degree of transparency we're actually going to need. Plausibly, we're not going to need the kind of transparency that tells me exactly what in each individual node in an AI system is doing at all the time. We're going to need the kind of transparency that gives us the kind of effective strategies that can help us forward. Again, speaking very, very colloquially, I need to know what kind of sweater I should be wearing at my job interview, right? Good. Some criticism, or, well, it's not criticism on anything I said because it predates it, but some people have said that, listen, there's just no such thing as causal explanation in these complex algorithms. They're just so complex, there's no causal explanation. Having read through this, all I can say is this must be a confusion. I don't know exactly what the confusion is. It's either a confusion between causal explanation and full causal explanation, right? So a causal explanation of why a window shatters might be that Susie threw a rock at it. A full causal explanation of why the window shatters is in excruciating detail explain you all of the physics of the little particles in the rock that made it the case that the window couldn't but have shattered. And going very quickly here, this is known in the literature on causation for years and years and years now, that kind of full causal explanation, as I call it now, is never available to anyone, and would require like in-depth knowledge of fundamental physics and in-depth knowledge of the exact position of all the particles. And by all of the particles, I mean, all of the fundamental entities in the world, in the how do I say this? In the surroundings as wide as something like 300,000 kilometers from where the effect took place. But that is not the kind of causal explanation we ever use, ever, for anything, right? When you come down into your basement and you see that it's flooded, that's not the kind of causal explanation you're going to get from an expert. Causal explanation you're going to get from an expert is very coarse-grained. It's going to tell you something very simple, like, oh, as it happens, this valve was off when it needed to be on, and that's it. And the same holds with these super complex algorithms. Of course, when we look at them in full detail, they are immensely complex, and we will never grasp them in full for any single outcome. I'm happy to believe that, because that's what I believe about physical systems as well. But that does not mean that I cannot get a causal explanation in the form of, oh, you wore a red sweater, therefore you didn't get the job, no matter how complex the algorithm is that is underlying that. So I think that there might be a confusion here about what causal explanation ever achieves in the normal world, even setting aside AI, right? So I think there must be causal explanation available. Now, another question is the difficulty between availability in principle and availability in practice. I don't want to deny that quite often we just don't have access to it, but that's just to say that the system is too opaque. But that doesn't mean that it's not available in principle. And there's all kinds of technical implements people have used to get to these kinds of explanation. And I'm not on the technical side of this debate, so I don't have that much to say on it. But it does seem that regular counterfactual testing of what would the system say if you were a red sweater versus a blue sweater would be no less effective for complex systems than it is for simple systems. Then in the literature, there's this other line of thought saying that, well, really, we need to distinguish between like yay amount of kinds of explainability or transparency. There's explicability, there's traceability, there's simulatability, scrutability, like it goes quite far. And again, this is the hand-wavy slide. I'm happy to talk about it more. But it seems to me that many of these differences are very important, but I see no reason why they cannot be cashed out in terms of causal explanations at different levels, or causal explanations using different contrasts, or causal explanations using different details. So the traceability of a signal through a system would seem to me to be a causal explanation at a very fine level of detail. Whereas the post hoc explanation of why I did not get the job based on the fact that I wore a blue sweater is just a different level of description of the same thing, but both would be causal. I think this is the only slide in which I go into or suggest some depth to the causation literature. So feel free to ignore it fully if you think it is boring and uninteresting. I respect that. Okay. Turning back here, what I wanted to say really is opacity and transparency are just two polar opposites of how much causal explanation I have available for a certain outcome. How much causal information do I have available for the outcome that I did not get this job or that I did get this job, right? Now, why would that be of interest to me? I said, okay, we love explanation, it turns out. Why do we love explanation? Well, if A causally explains B, then in principle, I could have affected B by causally affecting A in the right way, right? And this is basically becoming the mainstream view on causation in both philosophy and causal modeling literature more broadly, and in cognitive science literature about the value of causal information. So the idea is that if I had known that wearing a blue sweater to my job interview could have gotten me the job, then that would have given me an effective strategy of reaching my outcome. If I wanted the job, I could have went out of my way to wear a blue sweater, right? Here's a more interesting example, I guess. Suppose I'm trying to get into Harvard Law School, but the Harvard Law School admission procedure is completely opaque to me, right? I have no idea what they care about when I apply. The application process is 2 years in my future. I'm an undergrad somewhere. I'm trying to live my life. What am I to do, right? How am I going to effectively pursue my life dream, so to speak, of getting into Harvard Law School? Should I join the Model United Nations, right? Because I think that's going to show how I'm engaged with global politics on at least an intellectual level, and I know how to discuss issues and work together in a team? Or should I take an extra math credit because math credits make me look smart? I don't know, right? I don't know what the effective strategy is, right? And I think in general, my autonomy would be undermined in the sense that my ability to shape my life according to my own life plans would be undermined, right? We have all kinds of life plans. We want to be, we want to go to Harvard Law School. We want to start a family. We want to live in an area we like. And all of these life dreams or life plans are contingent on certain processes going the way we expect them to go, or the way we would aim for them to go. So in as far as these processes are opaque, or we don't have a grasp of the relevant kind of causal explanations for the outcomes to be, we have no access to the effective strategies that we would use, right? The way you live life is you have a certain goal and you try to work towards that goal. But if the strategies are completely inaccessible to you, you can't really work towards that goal in any effective sense. So that is the way in which I mean you're undermining the user autonomy or the autonomy of the affected parties. So I use the dumb sweater example, I use the Harvard example, but of course it spreads out throughout, like loans, social benefits, job applications, whatever it is that people use for the kind of decisions that really affect our life thoroughly and our life paths. So here's how I summarize it. Opaque decision systems hide salient pathways of affecting their outcomes and therefore for shaping our lives. Why is this important? It's important because I think it's intuitively important, but also the notion of autonomy, the idea of self-determination, carving out your own life path, has made its appearance in foundational texts in applied ethics. There's all kinds of variations. However, there is a growing attention to the long-term planning's importance for autonomy. Even, again, this is very hand-wavy towards the literature in ethics. Even people who are more internalist-minded about autonomy accept the importance of reliable information. And autonomy interacts with responsibility. And I'd like to add here that like autonomy also has a place in the EU law, or at least people think so. The autonomy of humans is taken to be a legal foundation for things as well, and in politics as well. So in as far as we have reason to think that the opacity of decision algorithms will undermine our autonomy, we also have reason to think that something very significant would be happening, both morally and politically, and politically and legally speaking. I'm gonna skip the responsibility bit. Okay, so maybe some practical consequences you might ask. As I said, a real question is, how detailed are the kinds of explanations that we need? How much transparency can we ask? And I think the transparency we would like, in as far as our autonomy is concerned, is the kind of a transparency that would give us the effective strategies, right? So I need to know, should my sweater be blue or red? Do I need to know how the machine is wired exactly to make that decision? I know I use wired as if this is like made in the 1800s, but this is just to show you how much I understand computers. No, we don't. It's the simple answer, right? I need to know that I need to know the kind of details that give me a causal grasp on what what I am supposed to do. Am I supposed to get very good math credits, or am I supposed to go for extracurriculars? These are the kinds of, this is the kind of knowledge I need. It's not the kind of knowledge of how exactly does an AI work. As I said, the law to some extent is on our side. Wachter et al. Have pointed out that current implementations of the AI ethics law, the AI laws, do not give us a full right to explanation, even though like the terms right to explanation show up in them. I think this is a very interesting debate, and I'm happy to talk more about it and hear other people's thoughts on it. But there is this genuine idea that the right to autonomy is written in the Convention of the Human Rights, the EU Convention on Human Rights. Having said that, the word autonomy doesn't show up in the text at all. So this is mostly jurisprudence and legal scholarship that says that it is sort of indirectly encoded. So I think there's a lot of further questions to be asked about if we are gonna place our bet for asking for more explanations on an autonomy question, and we want to build that on the law. Exactly where are we gonna put our hooks in, so to speak? Because some people think is directly follows from some laws, but on the other hand, again, the word autonomy simply does not show up. Same with the US Constitution, by the way, as it happens. And then none of what I've said should be taken to be a knockdown argument for all procedures in the world being transparent, or all procedures that are important for us to be transparent. I think this is all a pro tanto issue, right? That means that, well, all else equal, we should prefer a transparent system over a non-transparent system. But maybe there's very good reasons to make certain decisions not transparent. Here are some reasons. So Weller is the person who I've read the text where they explain, well, sometimes giving an explanation will fool you into thinking that things are reasonable, even though they're not. Remember the person cutting in line and you say, hey, what's up? And they just say, oh, I'm in a hurry. Apparently people take that as an explanation. But of course, that's, you knew they were in a hurry. You know they wanted to get there first, right? That's not further information you ever got. T. Nguyen has written a recent paper in which he just says that if we make everything transparent to the public, that means that all the criteria we use are beholden to the opinions of the public. But then we're basically wasting the potential of all of our experts, right? Because we have these highly trained experts. I should have made this clear. Nguyen does not talk about AI specifically, but talks about human experts, but I think it transfers. So he says we have these highly trained experts to become very good at detecting things. And it's not always easy to explain how they do that. But if they always have to explain how they do that to the public, then they're going to have to dumb it down. And in the end, they'll only use the kind of criteria that the public would understand. The same, I would think, applies to AI, right? One of the benefits of AI, supposedly, is that it detects patterns that we couldn't even think of, right? So if we have to make these AI systems transparent to the public, we're basically wasting its potential for picking up on patterns that we wouldn't even grasp. So if it's going to make for more reliable detection of something, we shouldn't sort of cull its possibilities of doing so by always demanding explanations, one might think. Finally, there's what is called Goodhart's law, or Campbell's law as well, I think, is the idea that as soon as you start using some proxies for measuring something, so say I use certain proxies for measuring how good a student you would be at Harvard Law School, for example, I check whether you went to debate club. That might be a very good proxy for how interested you are in arguments, how interested you are in consuming information quickly. But as soon as word gets out that I am going by your debate club membership. All kinds of people are going to register for debate club just to get into Harvard Law School. It no longer tracks this inner drive, so to speak, to argue and to consume information. So there might be a worry that making procedures more important is going to make them more transparent, is going to make them more unreliable. Sorry, I said more unreliable. An easier way to say that is less reliable. Merely in virtue of the public, so to speak, being aware of which criteria go in there. Renee Jorgensen-Bollinger actually recently wrote a very interesting paper about transparency in the legal sphere for bail hearings, etc., where she argues that actually, when you look at the kind of criteria that could be permissible, Goodhart's law is very unlikely to feature in the legal system. I just flagged that. I can't get into the details of it now, but I thought it was a very interesting paper for the people who are interested. And that's all for me. Thanks, everyone, for sitting through this, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Bram, for this engaging presentation. And we're opening up the floor for questions. Bram, maybe you can take down the slides so we can see each other a bit better.
Good.
So Peter is waving. Do you want to ask something?
I just wanted to something you said towards the end of your talk there. I was kind of thinking of basically the whole way through. So you said, like with experts, if you made them explain everything, then it would be kind of a waste of their time. But so that's thinking like that. Maybe what's important here is like we will complain. We're less likely to complain about a lack of transparency if there is actually plenty of evidence that the decisions that are made are very good.
Yeah.
So like, for example, last time I flew into Landvetter, the pilot told us over the radio that the computer was going to land the plane because there was a thick fog. And I don't think that really upset people, like, because, the plane landed safely and it's done it like thousands of times before. But I mean, when it comes to things like job applications, bail decisions, medical products, things like this. Well, one thing is like, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that experts don't make very good decisions. And then also it's not clear like the feedback is not clear. Like if the computer either lands the plane or it doesn't land the plane, or it doesn't. Whereas in many situations, it's not clear what success is. Like, what is it? How do you decide whether the right decision was made for a job application or?
Right.
So isn't that the case? Like that's the reason why we're more likely to complain about lack of transparency if actually there is good reason to do so. In other words, that there isn't clear evidence that the decisions that are being made are better decisions.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I think that's definitely true. So I was in a paper I wrote about this. I tried to make this, just do this little thought experiment where you say, well, let's suppose that we just have all of this. Suppose that some state decides that all state employees, like all job applications there, will go through this one system, and that's the system that decides. And we've been doing this for 20 years, and all kinds of tests have been done that we find independently reliable, and shows out that we really have been getting the best. Like, it's very inconceivable that we could have done better. And I think that, like, what that would do to us is, of course, this is just guessing, right? But based on the things you said as well, it would make us trust the system, I think. We would feel less of a pressure to have the system be transparent. But I still think that it's conceivable that in that world, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with my life if I want to be a state employee. right? And as I said, I think all of this is pro tanto reasoning. So I think that like maybe on the balance that might be worth it, right? If the world turns out to be this way. But I think we're never going to have such a clean case in most of these cases. As you say, really figuring out whether you hired the best employee is nigh impossible, right? I'm assuming most of us have been in these situations in the past where you go to the job applications and you're like, well, you know, the first 7 are really good, but who's to say? So I think that this is just a case where we're going to have to balance all of these things in like whatever muddy and unclear way that we can. And then in the end, decide whether we're going to put some weight on the autonomy of the people who are supposed to apply for these jobs or loans or whatever, or not. But I definitely do agree that as soon as we sort of have independent reason to believe in the reliability of a system, or knee-jerk reaction to ask for more explanation or transparency is diminished.
Okay, so we have a question from Beatrice in the chat. Beatrice, do you want to grab the microphone and spell out what you're wondering? Okay. Yeah, so let me try and read what you say. Hey, I was wondering what you think about having these requirements imposed, including transparency, diversity, fairness, explainability to AI developers, for instance, by the AI Act law in a couple of years, similarly to GDPR a couple of years ago?
Yes, thank you. So I think definitely as things stand, these kinds of things should probably be imposed by law, is my view. But there have been, like, for both the GDPR and the AI Act, there has been considerable literature now on whether or not they give us any transparency requirement, really. And the GDPR basically does not really, in part because it conflicts with a whole lot of patent law, and the kinds of explanation they owe us are very, very vague. The AI Act law the AI Act proposal last I checked had some very, as soon as it, interestingly, so they did make a distinction between the kinds of mechanisms that will make life-changing decisions and those that don't. That's probably not the terminology they use, but so making things like job applications more transparent was something that was written in there. But interestingly, all of that transparency is directed towards the users of the system and not the affected parties. And that, I think, is a significant difference, right? And I think this user transparency has all kinds of advantages in terms of reliability and knowing what you're doing and blah, blah, blah. But it generally does nothing, I would think, for the autonomy of the affected parties, because as an affected party, your right to transparency would not be very safely encapsulated.
Okay, there seems to be a question from Anne-Catherine.
Yes, hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I had 2 questions, but let me start with first. One question I had was, and you briefly touched about it, but what is exactly the difference? Because you talk about opaque systems, and then you say, okay, we also have opaqueness in general. So, and then you ask the question about how detailed should the insight that we have into certain systems be? And the question is, yeah, isn't that's of course a problem in general? And do you think there are certain standards, for example, take the Harvard example, to get also more insight into normal systems, or why to focus specifically on technology, or what's the issue that, because I struggle with it myself, what's the specificity of the explainability in the problem with technology? Because it seems like the Harvard, the judges, that's of course also a problem. First question, and then second, because you briefly touched upon it, but you skipped it. Could you say a bit more on autonomy and responsibility, the link between the two?
Good. Thanks. Those are great questions. So I'm afraid, like, for the first question, this is all gonna be on a case-by-case basis, I think. How specific is the information we need? Well, it'll depend on what we're doing with it. I think there's very interested work in like philosophy of explanation on like the context dependence of explanation and the kind of contrasts we need and the kinds of level of detail we need. But I think very like broad strokes, this is going to be interest relative. So to take one example, I think, for example, that in the detecting Alzheimer case, reliability is probably something that you'd want more than transparency, because these are not like what symptoms I exhibit in that test, if it's sort of a speech test or whatever. These should not be things that are like under my control in that way, right? So my autonomy in that sense should not be in their mind. But like when it is concerning life decisions, it would seem that the kind of information I would want is the kind of information I could in principle make changes about. For example, my degree of education or my extracurriculars, right? So I think it's sort of an interest relative case by case basis. And there's like the philosophy literature and the explanation literature has like the broad strokes models to explain to you, you know, how to put it in a little picture. But what goes in that little picture is going to be a case-by-case analysis of like, well, what are the interests of the affected parties here? What are the possible privacy considerations that we have to take into account? And again, as you say, like, well, but what is it now specifically about technology that makes this more or less of a problem? And I think there's nothing specific about technology that makes it more or less of a problem at the general level. I think it is exactly when we go into the specifics of one of like the interest relative question is like, well, will there be a technological boundary to us getting that kind of information or not? And would this new technology make it harder or easier to get that kind of information rather than when we use humans, so to speak, right? Or whatever the close by alternative is, right? So I think that's the way to go there, is just a question in this specific case, would technology help us or not help us to get that kind of information? And I don't think, again, I'm not somebody who does the technical side of things, but from all I've read, I see no in principle reason why it would be either so much better or so much worse when we use technology. I do think that people are right when they say these things like we have a certain fetishization for automatization. We feel like, oh, if it's automatized, then it must be right. And that's a bias we're going to have to take into account and we're going to have to deal with. But then, you know, humans are very bad at making decisions, right? In other ways as well. I think, as Peter said, you know, the experts making job application decisions, you know, there's all kinds of reasons to believe that they're not very good at that. Debiasing a human is incredibly hard. There's no reason to believe that it's any easier than debiasing an algorithm. And again, like these are sort of, I'm afraid these are the hard questions of life. I have no solution to it. Could you remind me of the second question? I'm sorry, I went on a rant and then.
The relationship between autonomy and responsibility.
Oh yes, of course. So I think in general, there's this feeling that in order to be responsible for an outcome, you have to have been an autonomous agent in that outcome. So I think, for example, holding me responsible for not getting into Harvard Law School, I want to bracket this. I never applied to Harvard Law School. I had no dreams of getting in there. This is not some revenge project. I just think it's a salient example. I think my responsibility for not getting into law school or getting into law school would be severely undermined if I was not an autonomous agent in the question. If I had no, in principle, access to the effective strategies that I could have done. that I could have performed. If I just had no way of knowing what I should be doing, then I cannot be responsible for the outcome. Is like all kinds of counterexamples, like, philosophy, right? There's all kinds of counterexamples that abound, but like in the broad strokes, that's what we think. Like, in order to be responsible for me crashing my car, I had to be an autonomous agent in doing that. It can be the case that some guy just like sidelined me when I was doing nothing wrong, and there was nothing I could do about it, right? So I think in general, also what this means is that if we're going to systematically undermine our autonomy in society, we will be less responsible for our own lives. I think there's like a further, like when you talk to ethicists about this, they'll say like, well, is that good or is that bad that we're less responsible for our own lives? And I actually, I don't really have an answer to that either. But I think at the very least, it would be an interesting upshot that if we use these kinds of opaque systems across the board in all kinds of things, people would lose the responsibility for their own lives. If nothing else, it seems like it would be an interesting outcome. Does that answer your question?
Next question is from Alexander.
Thank you. Interesting talk. I agree with about your main points. What I'm not entirely sure about is you say that some technical details about how these models work may not be so important. There are certain differences that I think matter for your points, for the points you're making. So if you take a very opaque model like a deep neural network, then the kinds of counterfactual explanations that can empower affected parties are, I agree that you can still get counterfactual explanations from these models, but since they have a very intricate decision landscape with a very, these non-linearities and complex interactions between variables, then it's difficult for people to understand in what way something needs to change in order to get a different outcome. Yes, you can get these, individual points, like if your shirt was red, but in fact, it's like if your shirt was slightly more red and this thing, or much more red and this other thing.
Yeah. Good.
So I think there are important differences.
Right. So I think that's definitely true. But what I think what I want to stick by is like these the details are important, and I think this is again, I think this is not specific to AI. I think this is something that in philosophy of causation and explanation across the board is held. The details are important in as far as they would, as you say, sort of disturb the more coarse-grained patterns, right? So if it's just not strictly speaking true that just wearing a blue sweater would have made me get the job, but it's only blue sweater plus like all kinds of other variables having precise values, right? If it's that sort of sensitive and fragile to outside information, then yes, then that detail does matter. But then we have to start asking ourselves, like, what is it actually tracking? And if it's going to track this only this widespread patterns and nothing more stable and coarse-grained, then maybe this computer is onto something very special about the relation between the color of your shirt and what glasses you wear, or maybe it's picking up on a lot of noise that it shouldn't be picking up on. And I think like that's again where we have to I have to assume to make these questions work that at least these systems track something that we naturally track in the world. And I think in general, we can allow for some kind of sensitivity to outside factors, because if we don't, we'll never get an explanation for anything. And again, this is true in the non-AI world and the AI world alike. But if it becomes too sensitive, then I do think the kind of explanations we actually need would not be available. So the bottom line is, yes, I think the details are important, but they would be important to the extent that they can or cannot sort of underpin the coarse-grained explanations that we would be interested in. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks. That was a good question. I liked it.
Thank you, Bram, and thank you everyone for participating in this discussion. We are out of time, so I'm officially closing the seminar and